I wanted to make a video today talking about healing and what is healing, what causes illness, and how can we engage in the healing process in a meaningful way. So I think to start this conversation off, it's important to talk about what causes illness in the first place. And I have to say I take a very shamanic point of view in this way. So one of the things that I believe is that illness starts primarily from a fundamental disconnection from ourselves. And I'll get into all of these things more in depth, but I just want to outline a few things. So disconnection from the self. Secondly, a lack of self-love. And thirdly, I just want to just say that it's when we think about healing and we think about the body, it's interesting to think about the body as a reflection of the mind. So one of my teachers taught us this, and she would always say the body reflects the mind, the body reflects the mind. And it wasn't until I got out into practice myself that I saw, wow, that's actually totally true. So let's get into these things a little bit more in depth. So what do I mean by a disconnect from ourselves? What I mean by that is a couple of things. So first of all, as soon as we're in the world, and I would even argue, to be honest, prenatally and maybe even before we are conceived, we learn very quickly what is appropriate behavior, what is not appropriate behavior, what we can express, what we shouldn't express. Something you see pretty commonly, unfortunately still, is parents telling their kids not to be so sensitive, or not to be so this, not to be so that. And you know, we're social beings, we're social animals. We need to feel like we belong, and we need to feel like we can be ourselves. But when we start getting these messages from the time that we are toddlers, usually, we learn very quickly which part of ourselves we need to disconnect from, which part of ourselves we need to shut down and suppress in order for us to be liked by the group, to fit into the group, and in order for us to be able to maintain our place within our social context. Mostly that's the family, but it speaks to a wider social context as well, right? So essentially what ends up happening is we disconnect from these certain parts of ourselves because we know that if we're too angry, if we're too jealous, if we're too loud, if we're too sensitive, then we won't be liked and we won't be included. Maybe we'll be ostracized, but the point is it'll create pain for us. The other way that we disconnect from ourselves, and they kind of tie together, but the other way that we do it is that, you know, if we go through something very traumatic or painful, sometimes the experience is so overwhelming that we literally have to disconnect in order to survive the situation. And, you know, in psychology, they call this dissociation. In shamanism, they call it soul loss, but it's essentially the same thing. And it's a situation where we're enduring so much pain. It could be physical, it could be mental, it could be emotional, it could be spiritual, it doesn't really matter. We're enduring so much of it that a certain part of ourselves has to leave the situation in order to survive it. And I just want to say quickly a piece on trauma. You know, I think we have this concept and this notion that trauma has to be this like really big, really horrific, intense event that happened to you. And sometimes it is, right? Sometimes that's exactly what happens. But a lot of the times it's not. A lot of the times it's little rejections over a long period of time. It's not being seen, not being heard, not feeling like you belong, not feeling like you're understood. I think these things are equally traumatizing over time, potentially. Not always, but they can be. And the analogy that I often use to explain it is, you know, if you're trying to fill a bucket of water, there are two ways that you can do it. You can have a slow drip, eventually it'll fill up, or you can turn the hose on full force and just throw it in the bucket, and it'll be done like that. So, you know, but I think we need to kind of look at trauma in a more holistic way, because little things, being picked on, being just never really feeling like you can truly be yourself, those things hurt. They really hurt. And over time, they really add up. But anyway, back to disconnection. So when we disconnect from ourselves, it's like those parts of us are now gone, and we're this fragmented person now. We're not really whole anymore. And sometimes this, it'll manifest as like you just never feel quite right. Something always feels off. You just never have energy. You feel numb inside emotionally. It can manifest in so many ways, but these are sort of the things that I hear quite often. And so, yeah, I think deep healing work is about calling those parts back in. In shamanism, this is soul retrieval, right? The shaman travels and tries to find that piece of yourself and calls it back. And I think if you're not doing that type of work, if you're just exploring and you are trying to figure out, how can I create wholeness in my life again? One of the ways is just to start accepting yourself more wholly and more fully as who you truly are. And this is where the lack of self-love comes in. So when I say that illness is caused by a lack of self-love, partly what I mean by that is if you truly loved yourself, it would be hard for you to smoke, to drink excessively, to eat so much sugar, to not exercise, to stay in difficult or abusive relationships. Do you know what I mean? I think when we truly love ourselves, we can recognize when something isn't good for us, and we have the self-respect and the courage to actually change it. I'll sometimes give the analogy to my patients of if there's somebody in your life that you really love, maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's your kid, maybe it's a pet, but something that you really love. Most of the time we want to protect it. We want to ensure that they're happy, that they're well nourished, that they're doing well, right? And I often ask, how much of those things do you apply to yourself? So if it's important to you to feed your kid well, do you also nourish yourself well throughout the day? Do you make sure that you're not thirsty? Do you make sure that you listen to your body's signals? Most of us, I think, as adults, we don't. We're sort of like, oh yeah, I'm hungry, but whatever, I'll do it later, or I'll eat later, I have to finish this or that. But self-love is about giving yourself what you need in that moment. And that can be on a physiological basis, i.e. food and water, or it can be on an emotional basis, right? Allowing yourself to feel the emotions that you need to feel. Allowing yourself to step out of relationships that no longer serve you or that in fact harm you. And I recognize that can be challenging, and there are lots of different reasons that people don't step out of those things, but I think ultimately so much of it does come back to self-love and a lack of self-love. And then when I talk about the body reflecting the mind, this is such a fascinating topic, and it's one of my favorites. But I look at the body I look at health in general as three things. I look at it as the body, the physical. I look at it as the mind, and I look at it as the spirit. And one of my teachers taught me that all of these three things have to be optimally functioning in and of themselves before they can really function well as a whole. And so, part of what we're looking at here is, so when let's say your issue is that you overeat. So when you overeat and you know that it's bad for you, and maybe you're eating terrible foods that are really harmful to your health, what's behind that for you? Because I think that's really important, is to get at that mental component of, okay, so before you reach for that food, what's the emotion behind it? What are you experiencing? What do you need? And sometimes it's easy to pinpoint that, and other times it's not. But I think that when we understand that our physical health in a lot of ways, and very often, is quite related to our thoughts about ourselves, the thoughts that we've thought about the world. Is the world safe? Is the world helpful and loving? Or am I fearful most of the time? And am I acting from a place of fear? Um, you know, it's amazing what happens. And just a concrete example of this, I had a patient who kindly gave me permission to share this story, but constipation was the chief concern. And we looked at everything from a physical perspective. So, you know, looked at some labs, looked at diet, looked at exercise, just even looked at, you know, food intolerances and things like that, and couldn't find anything. Like, we changed everything to the cleanest diet on the planet, and nothing shifted. But if you think about it energetically, what is constipation really? Constipation is a lack of movement, a lack of something that needs to be happening that isn't happening. So the question that I asked her eventually was, where in your life do you feel that way? Or is there a place in your life that you feel that way? And there was. And as soon as that was identified, we could then go back and say, okay, so why are things not moving in that situation? And what's your role in it? How could you behave differently so that things do move? And, you know, not that much longer later, about 3 weeks later, things had resolved. And actually her diet went back to worse than before, but it didn't impact anything. It was totally fine. So that's just one example. And yeah, healing, I think, is really about becoming whole again and allowing ourselves to feel what we need to feel. Yeah. I think that's it. I think that's all I wanted to say. All right, I hope this helped.